Welcome back, time traveler. Today, we're not sugarcoating it. No loincloth love stories. No Hollywood caveman fantasies. We're digging into the raw, brutal, and deeply human truth about sex in the Stone Age. Spoiler: it wasn't romantic. It was survival. Behind every prehistoric fire pit and painted cave wall was a story of desire. Dominance, fear, fertility, and power. Consent. Complicated. Pleasure. Rare. Social rules. Entirely different from what you'd expect. So if you're ready to peel back the fur and face what intimacy looked like when humanity was still learning how to be human, strap in. This is what was sex really like for the caveman. You wake up 40,000 years ago in what will one day be southern France. But right now it's just a cave overlooking a valley where mammoths trumpet in the morning mist. Your body aches from sleeping on stone. Your hair is matted with dirt and grease, and you can smell yourself. A pungent mixture of smoke, blood, and something far more primal. You're about to discover that everything you think you know about prehistoric romance is completely wrong. The woman beside you isn't your wife, in any sense you'd recognize. She's here because yesterday, your hunting group successfully brought down a woolly rhinoceros, and tonight, there will be meat. In the Paleolithic world, sex wasn't about love, marriage, or even attraction as we understand it. It was about survival, calories, and the brutal mathematics of staying alive another day. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic reveals that our Cro-Magnon ancestors lived in small bands of 25 to 30 people, where every sexual encounter was governed by complex social hierarchies that would make modern dating apps look simple. The famous Venus figurines found across Europe, those exaggerated female forms with enormous breasts and hips, weren't ancient pornography. They were survival manuals, carved reminders of what fertility looked like in a world where most children died before their 5th birthday. You scratch at the lice crawling through your scalp and realize the woman is watching you with eyes that have seen things no modern human could comprehend. She's calculating something, weighing options in a mental ledger where your value as a mate depends entirely on whether you can keep her alive through the next winter. The bones scattered around your cave tell the story of those who failed this test. But the morning light reveals something else entirely. Evidence that your ancestors' approach to sexuality was far stranger and more sophisticated than anyone imagined. The woman moves closer, and you catch her scent. Not the romantic notion of pheromones you might imagine, but something raw and informative. Recent analysis of Neanderthal DNA has revealed that our extinct cousins possessed a far more sophisticated olfactory system than modern humans, capable of detecting subtle chemical signals that determined everything from genetic compatibility to a potential mate's immune system strength. You breathe in deeply, your primitive brain processing information that your consciousness can't interpret. She smells of pine smoke from last night's fire, the metallic tang of mammoth blood from butchering, and underneath it all, something that makes your body respond without your permission. This isn't romance. It's biology conducting a complex chemical analysis to determine if your offspring would survive the next ice age. Evidence from Shandar Cave in Iraq, where Neanderthal remains were found surrounded by flower pollen, suggests that our ancestors understood the connection between scent and human behavior 60,000 years ago. They weren't decorating graves with flowers for sentiment. They were manipulating odors to communicate complex social and sexual messages to the living. The woman's eyes narrow as she studies your face, reading micro-expressions that would take modern dating coaches years to decode. Her people have survived the volcanic winter that followed the Lasham geomagnetic reversal 41,000 years ago, when ash blocked the sun for months and most human populations simply vanished. She can tell from your breathing, your posture, your scent, whether you carry the genetic resilience her children will need. You realize she's not looking at you with desire, But with the cold calculation of a genetic engineer, every movement she makes is a test. Every glance an evaluation. Your modern brain struggles to process this. But your body understands perfectly. You're not choosing a partner. You're auditing each other's DNA for survival potential. But what she does next will reveal the most disturbing truth about prehistoric sexuality. Without warning, she reaches out and traces a scar across your chest, a jagged line left by a cave bear's claw 3 winters ago. Her fingers are rough, calloused from scraping hides and digging for roots. And as she explores the mark, you realize she's reading your medical history through your scars. Each wound tells a story of survival. And in a world without words for most concepts, your body is a living resume. Recent forensic analysis of Cro-Magnon remains from Les Azys in France has revealed that our ancestors communicated sexual availability and genetic fitness through deliberate scarification and body modification. The intricate patterns carved into their bones weren't random. They were information systems, ways of broadcasting health, fertility, and survival skills to potential mates across the landscape. She runs her fingers along your arms, counting small marks that modern eyes would dismiss as random scratches. But each one represents a successful hunt, a survived winter, a moment when death came close and you proved stronger. Your skin is a library, and she reads it with the fluency of someone whose life depends on accurate information about genetic quality. The intimacy is unlike anything modern humans experience. There are no words for beautiful or attractive in your primitive vocabulary. There are only the concepts of strong, fertile, and likely to survive. Her touch isn't gentle exploration, but systematic evaluation, the same way she might examine a mammoth carcass to determine which parts are safe to eat. You mirror her movements, your hands mapping the evidence of her own survival. A thick white line across her shoulder blade speaks of a hunting accident that should have killed her. Calluses on her palms reveal years of hide scraping that produced the warm furs keeping your group alive. Each mark is a credential, proof of skills that could mean the difference between life and death for future offspring. But the most shocking discovery about prehistoric sexuality isn't written on skin. It's carved into stone, hidden in caves across Europe, waiting to overturn everything you think you know about human desire. She gestures toward the deeper recesses of your cave, where the walls are covered in images that would make archaeologists blush. But these aren't the famous hunting scenes or handprints tourists know. These are the hidden galleries, the artwork, too explicit for museum displays, where your ancestors documented their sexual practices with the same meticulous detail they used for tracking seasonal migrations. In 1994, French researchers discovered a Chauvet cave containing some of humanity's oldest known artwork. But what they didn't publicize were the explicit sexual images found in the deepest chambers. Detailed depictions of human copulation, genital worship, and fertility rituals that reveal how central sexuality was to prehistoric survival. The carbon dating is undeniable. These images are over 36,000 years old, created when ice sheets covered most of Europe. You follow her past crude drawings of coupled figures, noticing how the artists emphasized specific anatomical features with obsessive precision. The male figures sport grotesquely oversized genitals, while the females display exaggerated signs of fertility, swollen bellies, enlarged breasts, wide hips. This wasn't art for art's sake. It was instructional material, a visual guide to successful reproduction in a world where getting it wrong meant genetic extinction. The most disturbing images show group scenes, multiple figures engaged in what modern anthropologists delicately call communal reproductive activities. Evidence from genetic analysis of ancient European populations suggests that prehistoric bands practiced complex mating systems designed to maximize genetic diversity while maintaining social cohesion. What you're seeing on these walls isn't Ancient pornography. It's a user manual for species survival. She points to one particular sequence of images, a narrative that tells the story of a mating ritual from beginning to end. The figures progress through elaborate displays of physical prowess, competitive demonstrations of hunting skills, and finally, explicit copulation witnessed and apparently celebrated by the entire group. Your modern sense of privacy would be meaningless here. Reproduction was community business, too important to be left to individual choice. But the final chamber contains something that will shatter your understanding of prehistoric human sexuality entirely. In the deepest part of the cave, carved into living rock with primitive stone tools, you discover something that shouldn't exist. A three-dimensional sculpture of human reproductive organs, anatomically accurate down to details that wouldn't be officially discovered by medical science for another 35,000 years. The carving shows internal structures, ovaries, fallopian tubes, the cervix, rendered with the precision of a modern medical textbook. The woman touches the carving reverently, and you realize this isn't art or religion. It's science, recent. Analysis of similar carvings found in caves across the Dordogne region has revealed that Cro-Magnon groups possessed surprisingly sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy and reproduction. They understood concepts like ovulation cycles, fertility windows, and even the basic mechanics of conception that European doctors wouldn't rediscover until the Renaissance. She begins a rhythmic chanting, words in a language that died out before the pyramids were built, but the meaning is clear from her gestures. She's asking the stone fertility goddess for healthy children, for the strength to survive childbirth, for offspring who will carry her genetic line forward through the coming ice age. This carved vulva isn't primitive superstition, it's a medical device, a teaching tool used to train young women in the mysteries of their own bodies. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lull in France, where similar fertility carvings have been found, suggests that prehistoric societies developed systematic approaches to reproductive success that modern cultures have forgotten. They tracked the women's cycles with lunar calendars, timed mating to optimize conception chances, and developed herbal treatments for infertility that scientists are only now beginning to understand. You watch her perform this ancient ritual and realize that everything you thought you knew about primitive sexuality is backward. These people weren't fumbling around in ignorance. They were operating a sophisticated reproductive technology designed to ensure species survival in one of the harshest environments humans ever faced. Their knowledge of fertility and conception was arguably more practical and effective than what most modern people understand about their own bodies. But the most shocking revelation about prehistoric sexuality isn't carved in stone. It's written in DNA, and it's about to rewrite human history. As dawn light filters deeper into the cave, the woman produces something that shouldn't exist in the Paleolithic world. A small carved bone with intricate markings that represent a sophisticated understanding of heredity, recent genetic analysis of ancient European populations has revealed that our Cro-Magnon ancestors somehow understood concepts about inheritance and genetic diversity that wouldn't be formally discovered until Mendel's experiments with pea plants in the 1860s. She traces the bone carvings with her finger, showing you patterns that represent family lineages stretching back generations. The markings aren't random. They're genetic charts, ways of tracking which breeding combinations produce the strongest offspring and which led to stillbirths, deformities, or early death. Your ancestors were practicing selective breeding on themselves, with the same systematic approach later cultures would apply to crops and livestock. DNA evidence from Cro-Magnon remains found across Europe shows something extraordinary. Despite being scattered across thousands of miles of Ice Age landscape, these prehistoric populations maintained remarkable genetic diversity through carefully managed breeding networks. They somehow solved the problem of inbreeding depression that plagued many later isolated populations. suggesting a level of genetic understanding that modern science has only recently achieved. The woman sets the bone aside and looks directly at you, her expression shifting from ritualistic reverence to something more calculating. You realize she's been evaluating you this entire time, not just as a potential mate, but as a genetic contributor to carefully planned breeding program that spans multiple generations. Every interaction, every touch, every moment of intimacy has been part of an assessment process designed to optimize the survival chances of children not yet conceived. This wasn't random mating driven by passion or attraction. It was genetic engineering conducted by people who understood that their species stood on the knife's edge of extinction. Every sexual decision carried the weight of potential human survival. Every conception was a calculated risk in a game where losing meant the end of your genetic line forever. But the most disturbing aspect of prehistoric sexuality is yet to be revealed. Hidden in burial sites that tell a story of reproductive practices so extreme, they challenge everything we think we know about human nature. The woman leads you to a section of the cave floor where ancient bones protrude from the dirt. Not animal remains, but human skeletons arranged in patterns that tell a brutal story about reproductive success in the Ice Age. Forensic analysis of Paleolithic burial sites across Europe has revealed a shocking truth. In some prehistoric communities, women who failed to produce surviving offspring were systematically excluded from food distribution, shelter, and protection. You're looking at the remains of reproductive failure. The skeletons show signs of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and isolation from the group. Evidence that fertility wasn't just personal biology, it was social currency. Women who couldn't bear children became liabilities that starving communities couldn't afford to maintain. The harsh mathematics of survival meant that reproductive capacity determined not just social status, but life or death. Recent excavations at Sungir in Russia have uncovered graves that reveal the extreme measures prehistoric societies took to ensure reproductive success. Children who showed signs of genetic abnormalities were sometimes killed at birth, not from cruelty, but from the cold calculation that resources spent keeping them alive could instead support healthier offspring, who might actually reproduce. The woman's expression grows somber as she explains through gestures and primitive words that every woman in the group lives with the constant pressure of proving her genetic worth. Pregnancy isn't a private matter, it's a community investment. That requires justification. Women who miscarry repeatedly, who bear children that die young, or who show signs of reproductive aging, face systematic exclusion that amounts to a death sentence. You begin to understand that the sexual practices you've witnessed aren't driven by desire or affection, but by the desperate mathematics of species survival. Every intimate encounter is evaluated for its potential return on investment. Every pregnancy monitored for signs that the genetic gamble is paying off. Love, attraction, and personal choice are luxuries that evolution hasn't yet invented. What matters is whether your children will live long enough to reproduce. But the most horrifying discovery about prehistoric sexuality lies ahead, buried in the archaeological record of what happened when the Ice Age reached its brutal peak. As the morning progresses, the woman shows you evidence that will haunt your understanding of human sexuality forever. Deep in the cave's recesses, she uncovers carefully arranged bones that bear the unmistakable marks of stone tools, cut marks, scraping patterns, and deliberate breaking that can only mean one thing. These human remains were processed for food. Recent analysis of Neanderthal sites like Mouleguerque in France has revealed that during the worst periods of Ice Age climate, some groups resorted to consuming human flesh, not in random acts of desperation, but in systematic practices that targeted specific populations. The evidence suggests that reproductive outcasts, elderly individuals past breeding age, and children with genetic abnormalities were sometimes harvested as food sources to keep reproductively viable adults alive. The woman's gestures make clear the horrible logic behind these decisions. When mammoth herds disappeared during volcanic winters, when plant foods were buried under ice for months, when the choice was between certain death for everyone or selective cannibalism to preserve breeding populations, groups made calculations that would be unthinkable to modern minds. Sex and reproduction weren't separate from survival. They determined who lived and who became dinner. Isotope analysis of ancient bone collagen has confirmed these practices across multiple European sites. The chemical signatures in prehistoric human remains show clear evidence of anthropophagy. Humans consuming other humans during specific climate crises, but this wasn't random violence. It was organized resource management designed to preserve reproductive capacity through the darkest periods of human history. You stare at the processed bones and realize that every sexual encounter in this environment carried life or death implications not just for potential offspring, but for the participants themselves. Failed to prove your reproductive value, and you might end up as the protein source that keeps more genetically promising individuals alive through the next winter. The connection between sexuality and survival was literal, immediate, and terrifyingly direct. But even more shocking than cannibalism is what the archaeological record reveals about how these extreme conditions shaped human sexual behavior in ways that persist to this day. The woman begins a demonstration that reveals how extreme survival pressures literally rewired human sexuality, using primitive tools and animal bones. She shows you mating displays that combine elements of physical prowess, resource demonstration, and genetic advertising in ways that modern dating rituals still unconsciously echo. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kostenki in Russia shows that Cro-Magnon groups developed increasingly elaborate courtship behaviors during the harshest periods of the Ice Age. These weren't romantic gestures, they were survival auditions, where potential mates had to prove their ability to acquire resources, defend against predators, and survive environmental extremes that killed weaker individuals. She demonstrates how men in her group compete through displays of hunting skill, crafting ability, and physical endurance that would make modern extreme sports look recreational. The winner doesn't just get the girl. He gets access to reproductive opportunities that could determine whether his genetic line survives the next climate catastrophe. Every aspect of these competitions has been optimized through thousands of generations of deadly selection pressure. But the women's role is equally complex and calculated. Recent analysis of ancient European DNA has revealed that prehistoric females developed sophisticated strategies for maximizing their reproductive success, including practices that modern societies would consider scandalous. Women would sometimes mate with multiple males during their fertile periods, not from promiscuity, but to increase the chances of conception and to ensure that several males would invest resources in protecting potential offspring. You watch her demonstrate these ancient mating rituals and realize that human sexuality evolved under conditions so extreme that every impulse, every attraction, every sexual behavior was shaped by the constant threat of extinction. The desires you feel, the attractions that seem natural, the relationship patterns that modern humans struggle to understand, all of it was forged in the crucible of Ice Age survival, where getting sex wrong meant genetic death. But the most startling revelation about prehistoric sexuality comes from evidence of practices so sophisticated they challenge everything we think we know about primitive human intelligence. In a hidden alcove of the cave, the woman reveals prehistoric humanity's most guarded secret. They had developed sophisticated methods of birth control thousands of years before agriculture, writing, or civilization. Recent ethnobotanical analysis of plant remains found in Paleolithic sites has identified several species that contain natural contraceptive compounds, suggesting that our ancestors understood how to prevent pregnancy when conditions weren't favorable for childrearing. She shows you dry plants arranged in careful combinations, juniper berries, wild carrot seeds, and other specimens that modern pharmaceutical research has confirmed contain effective anti-fertility agents. These weren't accidental discoveries. Isotope analysis of ancient human remains shows that prehistoric populations somehow managed to time their reproduction to coincide with optimal resource availability. Despite lacking modern calendar systems or medical knowledge, the implications are staggering. While you've been thinking of prehistoric sexuality as uncontrolled biological drive, the reality is that our ancestors developed family planning technologies that some modern populations still lack. They understood that bringing children into the world during climate crises, food shortages, or social instability was essentially murdering them slowly. So they developed ways to prevent conception until conditions improved. Archaeological evidence from caves across the Pyrenees shows that some Cro-Magnon groups maintained detailed knowledge of herbal contraception for thousands of years, passing the information through maternal lineages using oral traditions that survived longer than most written languages. The women who controlled this knowledge wielded enormous power, essentially determining the genetic future of their communities. But this reproductive control came with a dark price. Recent analysis of prehistoric European demographics suggests that the contraceptive knowledge was sometimes weaponized, used to prevent undesirable genetic combinations or to eliminate reproductive opportunities for individuals deemed unfit for breeding. Birth control wasn't just about family planning. It was a tool for genetic engineering that some groups used to systematically alter their population's genetic makeup. The woman's next revelation will show you how this prehistoric understanding of reproduction led to practices that modern science is only beginning to comprehend. In a hidden alcove of the cave, the woman reveals prehistoric humanity's most guarded secret. They had developed sophisticated methods of birth control thousands of years before agriculture, writing, or civilization. Recent ethnobotanical analysis of plant remains found in Paleolithic sites has identified several species that contain natural contraceptive compounds, suggesting that our ancestors understood how to prevent pregnancy when conditions weren't favorable for childrearing. She shows you dry plants arranged in careful combinations, juniper berries, wild carrot seeds, and other specimens that modern pharmaceutical research has confirmed contain effective anti-fertility agents. These weren't accidental discoveries. Isotope analysis of ancient human remains shows that prehistoric populations somehow managed to time their reproduction to coincide with optimal resource availability. Despite lacking modern calendar systems or medical knowledge, the implications are staggering. While you've been thinking of prehistoric sexuality as uncontrolled biological drive, the reality is that our ancestors developed family planning technologies that some modern populations still lack. They understood that bringing children into the world during climate crises, food shortages, or social instability was essentially murdering them slowly. So they developed ways to prevent conception until conditions improved. Archaeological evidence from caves across the Pyrenees shows that some Cro-Magnon groups maintained detailed knowledge of herbal contraception for thousands of years, passing the information through maternal lineages using oral traditions that survived longer than most written languages. The women who controlled this knowledge wielded enormous power, essentially determining the genetic future of their communities. But this reproductive control came with a dark price. Recent analysis of prehistoric European demographics suggests that the contraceptive knowledge was sometimes weaponized, used to prevent undesirable genetic combinations or to eliminate reproductive opportunities for individuals deemed unfit for breeding. Birth control wasn't just about family planning. It was a tool for genetic engineering that some groups used to systematically alter their population's genetic makeup. The woman's next revelation will show you how this prehistoric understanding of reproduction led to practices that modern science is only beginning to comprehend. The woman's expression darkens as she leads you to a section of the cave containing smaller skeletons, the remains of hybrid children whose genetic destiny was determined before birth. Recent forensic analysis of these specimens has revealed something that challenges everything archaeologists thought they knew about prehistoric humanity: systematic culling of offspring based on genetic characteristics. These hybrid children weren't all accepted into their communities. Evidence from multiple European sites suggests that some groups evaluated newborns for specific genetic markers and made calculated decisions about which ones received resources for survival. Children who inherited useful Neanderthal traits, like enhanced cold resistance or immune system advantages, were welcomed, while those who showed other characteristics were abandoned or worse. The bone analysis reveals a horror that modern minds struggle to process: prehistoric quality control for human reproduction. Measurements of cranial capacity, limb proportions, and other anatomical features show that these ancient peoples had developed standardized criteria for determining genetic fitness in their hybrid offspring. This wasn't random infanticide driven by scarcity. It was systematic genetic selection based on carefully developed criteria. She gestures toward carved symbols that appeared to represent a scoring system, ways of evaluating newborns for desirable traits within hours of birth. Recent comparative analysis with similar markings found across prehistoric Europe suggests that multiple groups developed compatible evaluation systems, implying communication networks dedicated to sharing information about successful hybrid combinations. The woman makes clear through primitive gestures that her own children will face these same evaluations. Every pregnancy is a genetic gamble. Every birth a potential success or failure measured against criteria developed through thousands of years of brutal selection pressure. The love between parent and child that modern humans take for granted was a luxury these people couldn't afford. Survival required evaluating offspring like livestock, keeping the strong and eliminating the weak. But the most chilling discovery about prehistoric hybrid breeding programs lies in evidence of what happened to the failures and how these practices shaped human behavior in ways that persist today. In the darkest corner of the cave, the woman shows you evidence that will forever change how you understand human nature. Carefully arranged in small alcoves are the skeletons of infants and children who failed prehistoric genetic evaluations. But these remains show no signs of violence or abandonment. Instead, they bear evidence of ritualistic treatment that suggests a complex relationship between practical genetic selection and emotional attachment. Recent taphonomic analysis of similar sites across Ice Age Europe has revealed that groups who practiced systematic offspring evaluation also developed elaborate burial rituals for the children who didn't meet survival criteria. The bodies were prepared with the same care given to adult community members, suggesting that eliminating unfit offspring wasn't done without emotional cost or moral consideration. The woman demonstrates through gestures how these ancient peoples developed psychological mechanisms for coping with decisions that would destroy modern parents. They created religious frameworks that transformed infanticide into spiritual service, convincing themselves that sending genetically disadvantaged children to the next world was merciful rather than murderous. The elaborate burial goods found with infant remains suggest genuine grief combined with practical necessity. Isotope analysis of prehistoric bones has confirmed that groups practicing these selection methods had significantly higher survival rates during climate crises compared to populations that kept all children alive. The harsh mathematics worked. Communities willing to sacrifice some offspring to ensure others' survival were more likely to persist through environmental catastrophes. Evolution rewarded the groups who could make these terrible calculations. But the psychological toll is written in the archaeological record. Evidence from habitation sites shows that communities practicing systematic genetic selection developed increasingly complex ritualistic behaviors, art forms focused on death and rebirth, and social structures designed to distribute the emotional burden of these decisions across the entire group, rather than leaving them to individual parents. The woman's next revelation will show you how these prehistoric practices of genetic selection created behavioral patterns that continue to influence human sexuality and reproduction today. As the woman continues her demonstration, you begin to understand that the trauma of prehistoric genetic selection didn't end with the Ice Age. It became embedded in human psychology at the deepest levels. Recent epigenetic research has revealed that extreme survival stress can alter gene expression in ways that persist for multiple generations, meaning that the experiences of your Ice Age ancestors literally changed the DNA that modern humans inherited. She shows you artifacts that appear to represent multi-generational family planning, carved objects that track not just immediate reproductive decisions, but genetic strategies spanning dozens of generations. The sophistication is staggering. These prehistoric peoples somehow understood that the breeding choices they made would influence their descendants' survival chances centuries into the future. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hochfels in Germany suggests that some Cro-Magnon groups maintained genetic records for hundreds of years, tracking which family lineages produced the strongest offspring and which combinations led to reproductive failure. They were conducting multi-generational genetic experiments using nothing but memory, oral tradition, and primitive record-keeping systems. The woman's gestures make clear that every person in her group carries the accumulated genetic wisdom and trauma of thousands of their ancestors' reproductive decisions. The attractions you feel, the mating preferences that seem instinctive, the unconscious criteria you use to evaluate potential partners, all of it was programmed by generations of ancestors who faced extinction-level selection pressure. Modern psychological research has confirmed that humans possess unconscious mate selection mechanisms that prioritize genetic markers associated with disease resistance, stress tolerance, and survival capabilities, exactly the traits that would have been most important during Ice Age crises. Your sexual desires aren't random. They're the product of prehistoric genetic engineering programs conducted by ancestors who understood that getting reproduction wrong meant species extinction. But the most disturbing legacy of prehistoric sexuality is yet to be revealed, hidden in archaeological evidence that shows how these ancient reproductive strategies created the psychological foundations for human civilization itself. The woman leads you to cave paintings that reveal prehistoric humanity's most sophisticated achievement: the development of psychological mechanisms that allowed large groups to coordinate reproductive strategies without descending into lethal competition. Recent analysis of Paleolithic art across Europe has identified recurring symbolic patterns that represent early forms of social contract, agreements about mating rights, resource distribution, and genetic management that enabled bands to grow beyond the small family groups that characterized earlier human populations. These cave paintings aren't just art. They're constitutional documents, establishing the rules that allowed prehistoric societies to manage sexuality and reproduction at scales never before achieved. The symbols represent complex agreements about who could mate with whom, how resources would be allocated to support different genetic lineages, and what happened to individuals who violated these reproductive protocols. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lascaux in France shows that some Cro-Magnon groups developed hierarchical mating systems where reproductive access was determined by demonstrated survival skills, resource contribution, and genetic quality. assessments. These weren't primitive harems based on physical dominance. They were sophisticated meritocracies, where sexual access was earned through community contribution and genetic merit. The woman demonstrates through elaborate gestures how these prehistoric social contracts required individuals to suppress immediate sexual impulses in favor of long-term genetic strategies that benefited the entire group. People had to learn to delay gratification, accept reproductive restrictions, and subordinate personal desires to community genetic goals, psychological capabilities. That became the foundation for all later human civilization. Modern anthropological research has confirmed that societies capable of managing reproduction at large scales consistently outcompeted groups that relied on individual mating choices or simple dominance hierarchies. The psychological traits required for reproductive cooperation: impulse control, long-term planning, acceptance of social hierarchies, willingness to sacrifice personal desires for group benefit, became the mental toolkit that enabled everything, from agriculture to urbanization to technological development. But the price of developing these civilizational capabilities was written in the genetic code itself, creating psychological conflicts that continue to torment modern humans. As you watch the woman perform increasingly complex reproductive rituals, you realize that the same psychological mechanisms that enabled civilization also created the sexual neuroses that plague modern humanity. The ability to suppress immediate mating impulses in favor of long-term genetic strategies required developing internal psychological conflicts that prehistoric humans never fully resolved. Recent neuroscientific research has revealed that humans possess competing neural systems for sexual behavior, ancient circuits that drive immediate mating impulses inherited from pre-civilization ancestors, and newer regulatory mechanisms developed during the Ice Age that enabled delayed gratification and reproductive planning. These systems are in constant conflict, creating the sexual anxiety, romantic confusion, and reproductive stress that characterize modern relationships. The woman's demonstrations make clear that her people live with constant psychological tension between biological drives and social requirements. Every sexual encounter involves complex calculations about genetic benefit, resource cost, and community approval that override natural attraction and emotional connection. The spontaneous sexuality that modern humans fantasize about never existed. Prehistoric reproduction was always mediated by social control and genetic strategy. Archaeological evidence from late Paleolithic sites shows increasing rates of psychological stress indicators in prehistoric populations as they developed more sophisticated reproductive management systems. Skull modifications, dental wear patterns, and bone chemistry all suggest that the mental strain of constantly evaluating sexual decisions for their genetic and social implications took a severe toll on individual psychological health. The cave paintings themselves become more complex and disturbing in later periods, filled with imagery that suggests anxiety, internal conflict, and psychological fragmentation. The same cognitive capabilities that enabled large-scale social cooperation also created the capacity for mental illness, sexual dysfunction, and the romantic confusion that modern humans mistake for normal relationship challenges. But the most shocking revelation about prehistoric sexuality is how these ancient psychological adaptations created the specific mental disorders and relationship problems that define contemporary human experience. The woman's final demonstration reveals how the prehistoric battle between biological impulse and genetic strategy created the psychological templates that continue to govern modern sexuality. Every contemporary relationship problem, commitment phobia, sexual addiction, romantic obsession, fertility anxiety, mate competition, can be traced directly to evolutionary adaptations developed during the Ice Age's reproductive crises. Recent Psychological research has confirmed that modern humans unconsciously evaluate potential mates using criteria identical to those employed by Cro-Magnon ancestors: genetic health markers, resource acquisition potential, survival capability indicators, and compatibility with long-term reproductive strategies. Dating apps and modern matchmaking services work because they tap into prehistoric mate evaluation systems that have remained unchanged for 40,000 years. The woman shows you carved symbols that represent emotional states modern humans would recognize: jealousy over reproductive access, anxiety about genetic quality, depression following reproductive failure, and obsessive attachment to genetically superior partners. These weren't primitive emotions. They were sophisticated psychological responses to survival pressures that required complex social coordination and long-term genetic planning. Archaeological evidence from the transition period between Paleolithic and Neolithic cultures shows that groups who successfully managed the psychological tensions between individual desire and reproductive strategy were the ones who survived to develop agriculture, permanent settlements, and eventually written civilization. The mental frameworks they developed became the cognitive architecture for all subsequent human social organization. But this psychological inheritance came with permanent psychological cost. Modern humans experience sexual and romantic relationships through mental frameworks developed for life or death, genetic decisions in extreme survival environments. The intensity, anxiety, and complexity of contemporary romance isn't cultural, it's evolutionary. The result of psychological adaptations that were literally matters of species survival for prehistoric ancestors. The woman's final gesture points toward the cave entrance, where morning light suggests the beginning of another day in humanity's ongoing struggle to balance biological drives with social requirements, a conflict that began in Ice Age caves and continues in modern bedrooms. As daylight strengthens outside the cave, the woman performs one final ritual that encapsulates everything you've learned about prehistoric sexuality. Using carved bones and primitive symbols, she demonstrates how every sexual decision made by your ancestors was essentially a genetic gamble where the stakes were species survival and the odds were calculated using sophisticated knowledge systems that modern science has only recently begun to understand. She arranges the bone symbols in patterns that represent probability matrices, ways of evaluating the likelihood that specific genetic combinations would produce offspring capable of surviving environmental challenges that hadn't yet occurred. Your Ice Age ancestors were essentially predicting the future, making breeding decisions based on anticipated climate changes, resource availability, and evolutionary pressures that wouldn't manifest for generations. Recent computational analysis of ancient European DNA has confirmed the accuracy of these prehistoric genetic strategies. The combinations that Ice Age people selected for enhanced immune systems, cold adaptation, stress tolerance, cognitive flexibility turned out to be exactly the traits that enabled their descendants to survive subsequent environmental challenges, including disease outbreaks, climate shifts, and the transition to agricultural societies. The woman's demonstration makes clear that every aspect of human sexuality that modern people experience as natural or instinctive was actually engineered by ancestors who understood that species survival required conscious manipulation of reproductive processes. The attractions you feel, the relationship patterns you follow, the sexual behaviors that seem automatic, all of it represents the successful outcome of thousands of years of systematic genetic experimentation. But the most profound realization is that this prehistoric genetic gamble is still ongoing. Every modern sexual decision, every choice about whom to mate with and when to reproduce, continues the genetic strategy games that began in Ice Age caves. Contemporary humans are still playing by rules developed when the species stood on the edge of extinction. still unconsciously implementing reproductive strategies designed for survival pressures that no longer exist. The morning light reveals the ultimate truth about prehistoric sexuality. It never ended. It just moved from caves to cities, from stone tools to dating apps, from tribal councils to individual choice, but the fundamental genetic calculations remain the same. As you prepare to leave the cave, the woman performs one final gesture that reveals the ultimate irony of prehistoric sexuality. Despite developing sophisticated genetic strategies, elaborate reproductive technologies, and complex social systems for managing mating, the fundamental human experience of sexual desire, romantic attachment, and reproductive anxiety remained essentially unchanged from the Ice Age to the present moment. She shows you the most recent cave paintings, images that could have been created yesterday rather than 35,000 years ago. The emotions depicted are immediately recognizable. The longing in lovers' eyes, the jealousy of rejected suitors, the joy of successful conception, the grief of infant loss. Underneath all the genetic calculation and survival strategy, prehistoric humans experienced the same emotional complexity that characterizes modern relationships. Recent neurological research has confirmed that the brain structures responsible for romantic attachment, sexual attraction, and pair bonding evolved hundreds of thousands of years before the Ice Age and remained essentially unchanged throughout all of human prehistory. The elaborate genetic strategies and reproductive technologies your ancestors developed were overlaid on top of emotional systems that were already ancient when Cro-Magnons first entered Europe. The woman traces symbols that represent the eternal human cycle: attraction, courtship, mating, reproduction, aging, death, and the transfer of genetic material to the next generation. Despite all the sophisticated knowledge and social control systems, each individual still experienced this cycle as a deeply personal journey filled with the same hopes, fears, and emotional intensity that characterizes modern human experience. Archaeological evidence from Paleolithic burial sites shows that prehistoric peoples experienced the same relationship patterns that define contemporary human sexuality: long-term pair bonds, serial monogamy, polyamorous arrangements, reproductive competition, and the full spectrum of sexual orientations and gender expressions. The genetic strategies were community-level phenomena, but individual experience remained irreducibly personal and emotional. The most profound realization is that all the genetic engineering, reproductive planning, and survival strategy couldn't eliminate the fundamental mystery and unpredictability of human sexual connection. Even with perfect information about genetic compatibility and survival odds, prehistoric couples still fell in love with the wrong people, made reproductive choices based on emotion rather than strategy, and experienced the same romantic chaos that characterizes modern relationships. As you watch the woman complete her ritual, you understand that the cave paintings aren't just historical records. They're mirrors, reflecting the unchanging human condition across tens of thousands of years of technological and social evolution. The hearts that beat in prehistoric chests experienced the same desires, the same conflicts, the same desperate need for connection that drives modern human sexuality. As you emerge from the cave into the full light of the Ice Age dawn, the woman makes a final gesture that shatters the illusion of temporal distance between prehistoric and modern sexuality. She points to her belly, swollen with the early signs of pregnancy, and then to you, making clear that your night together wasn't just historical education, but active participation in the same genetic strategies that have been playing out for 40,000 years. The realization hits with devastating clarity. You haven't been observing prehistoric sexuality from a safe historical distance. You've been living it. Every attraction you felt, every calculation you made about her genetic fitness, every moment of desire and assessment and choice, All of it followed the same patterns that your Ice Age ancestors established when the species faced extinction. The past isn't past. It's the living present, enacted in every modern bedroom and dating app and relationship decision. Recent archaeological evidence from sites across Europe has confirmed that the genetic strategies developed during the Ice Age never ended. They simply became unconscious. Modern humans continue to make reproductive choices based on the same survival criteria that govern Cro-Magnon mating systems. But we've forgotten the brutal logic behind our own behavior. We think we're choosing partners based on love, attraction, and compatibility, but we're actually implementing 40,000-year-old genetic algorithms designed for Ice Age survival. The woman's pregnancy represents the ultimate truth about prehistoric sexuality. It's not prehistoric at all. It's ongoing, active, and determining the genetic future of humanity right now. Every child born today carries the accumulated reproductive wisdom of thousands of generations of ancestors who faced extinction-level challenges and developed the psychological and social mechanisms that enabled species survival. But perhaps the most disturbing realization is that the Ice Age never ended. It just became psychological. Modern humans live with the same survival anxiety, the same reproductive pressure, the same genetic calculation systems that characterize life in Ice Age caves. We've simply moved the struggle from external environmental challenges to internal psychological ones. From literal survival to social and economic competition, from tribal genetic management to individual romantic choice, the woman smiles as she touches her pregnant belly. And you understand that the story of prehistoric sexuality isn't a historical curiosity. It's the blueprint for human reproductive behavior that continues to play out in every relationship, every sexual encounter, every reproductive decision made by modern humans who have forgotten that they're still living in the genetic shadow of the Ice Age. The caveman's approach to sex didn't disappear with the invention of agriculture and civilization. It became the unconscious foundation for all subsequent human romantic and sexual behavior. Your ancestors' genetic gamble paid off. You exist because prehistoric peoples developed sophisticated reproductive strategies that enabled species survival through the worst environmental crisis humans ever faced. But the cost was permanent psychological programming that continues to shape human sexuality in ways that modern people barely understand. Every time you feel attraction, make a relationship choice, or reproduce, you're continuing the genetic experiment that began in Ice Age caves and will continue as long as humans exist. The morning sun rises over a landscape that will someday become France. But the reproductive drama playing out in prehistoric caves continues in modern bedrooms, boardrooms, and dating apps, unchanged in its essential character despite 40,000 years of technological and social evolution. We are all still cavemen and cavewomen, following genetic scripts written when the species stood on the edge of extinction, playing out reproductive strategies that our conscious minds have forgotten, but our bodies and brains continue to implement with ruthless prehistoric efficiency. The weird history of caveman sexuality isn't history at all. It's the eternal present, the ongoing human condition, the genetic inheritance that makes us who we are and determines who we will become.